Hello and welcome everyone to our panel, Social Inequality as an Obstacle to Sustainable Development. We're looking today at a vicious cycle. Existing inequalities make populations more vulnerable to crises such as climate change and less able to adapt. Climate change, in turn, will only amplify those inequalities. That's also what we saw recently with the pandemic, which exposed existing inequalities from gender to healthcare access to income inequality. Its direct consequences and the consequences of the recovery that followed have now left governments with fewer resources to address the structural inequalities faced by their citizens as climate change worsens. Now, our panel today, which will discuss this, begin with Deborah Roberts. She is a scientist and professor at KwaZulu-Natal University in South Africa. She was co-chair of Working Group 2 for the 6th assessment of the International Panel on Climate Change, which focused on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Welcome, Deborah. Adriana Carvalho is delegation head for W20 Brazil, part of Brazil's G20 presidency in 2025. She counts more than 25 years' experience in diversity and inclusion, supply chains, and business management. Welcome, Adriana.
Thank you.
And Luciana Servo is president of the Institute for Applied Economic Research, which is part of the T20 think tank initiative for Brazil's G20 presidency. Luciana's background is in health and labor economics. Welcome, Luciana.
Thank you.
Let's jump right into it. Deborah, I want to begin with you. In this area, we often hear about win-wins from policy and topic experts. And I believe that would be mitigation, adaptation. Yesterday, in a different topic, you said that we're at a point with climate change and our delayed response to it that we're now looking at parsing out one set of losers from another set of losers. What does that mean for this topic, inequality?
Thanks, Stephen, for that question. And I think we've heard a very interesting story emerge from the podium behind us in the various keynotes. So the Federal German Chancellor today told us to look forward with our eyes open. And I think if we look forward to our eyes open, that really recalls what Johan said to us yesterday, which is climate change, biodiversity crises, none of those can be dealt with unless you deal with injustice and inequity. But Johan was also really, really clear, and this is a tough message coming from the scientific community, is given our lack of ambition, we are likely to cross 1.5 degrees. So we're likely to go into overshoot. And that means we haven't been ambitious enough. That also means we haven't dealt with social inequality. So what we're looking forward to is a world which is very different to the world that we're currently in. I mean, the last time the world was in this state was 3 million years ago in the Pliocene when we had camels roaming the high Arctic with forests. So we don't know how to live in that world. But if we go into a world of overshoot, we'll have people dealing with the impacts of that, more extreme and intense events. And we were just talking about the challenges that are being experienced in Brazil with the floods. But we've also heard in this narrative that the poor and vulnerable will also have to deal with the pain of transition, because we'll be called upon now to act even more aggressively on things like carbon dioxide removal, which have consequences, for example, for things like food and water security. And it also means that we'll still have to be dealing with those fundamental problems: poverty, inequity, justice, colonialism, past and present. And so that's why we need to look into this world of win-lose scenarios and be thinking about the tools for that world, because I've not heard one single person in this very high-powered meeting over the last 1.5 days, which is talking about the time in between overshooting and returning. It's almost like we don't want to admit that that time exists. But we'll have 30 to 40 years, according to the science, of a deeply suboptimal world, of high inequality, of high injustice, of high impacts. And that's a different world. It needs a different tool set to the one we're talking about. So that, for me, is the big challenge. We need a new toolbox for the world that's coming.
Is it also more politically difficult to focus on solutions when it's not even politically wanted to discuss the topic of overshoot? We are at a solutions forum. We're supposed to be talking about solutions. that outlook sounds very bleak to me. How do you focus on solutions when we're still talking about 1.5?
Absolutely, and that's my frustration as someone who comes from the sciences but also has 30 years working at the grassroots as a local government practitioner, is that we don't yet have the political will to say that the time when we could have mitigated and adapted our way out of the problem has gone. And so now we're looking at an entirely different future and a different toolbox, and we need to be thinking about that now. So think about a continent like Africa. If a period of overshoot means indigenous crops might go extinct, and we certainly showed that in our 6th assessment report, that there'll be irreversible change during the period of overshoot. The natural systems will be the first to be impacted. So let's assume, for the sake of our argument, indigenous crops are impacted. We need to be thinking now about, for example, seed banks, if those are going to be the irreversible losses. You can't wake up on Monday morning when the IPCC announces we've suddenly crossed 1.5 and say, what do I do now? That planning needs to happen here. So the big message is keep working aggressively and ambitiously as you can, but broaden your risk landscape and acknowledge that this other world may in fact materialize and prepare for it.
Luciana, as someone who is working with the Brazilian government on this issue of inequality for its G20 presidency, you're part of these discussions. Is what Deborah's saying about sort of this unspoken area of after overshoot, is there truth to that, that this really isn't so much of the focus, that we're talking about other areas of this issue? How do you see it from your work?
When you come to the G20 Brazil, there is a declaration of inequality in the center of the debate. So you bring the climate action, the sustainability, but also inequality. We understand these two things are completely linked to each other. We cannot deal with one thing as defining at 1.5 without tackling inequalities, and we have in the world an increasing inequality. We're not seeing a decreasing inequalities, not only from income, but other kinds of inequality between the populations in each country, but between countries, we're huge increase in inequalities. So to deal with this effects of the climate change on the population, the poor ones, or the ones that are in the slums, the women, the children, the traditional populations, we also have to deal with the inequalities in the same time, the same pace, because we're establishing goals, but they are separate goals. So we have to bring it together and then combining them in an action that's the debate about inequality and climate action come together. That's what we're bringing to the table in the G20 and also in the engagement groups, in the Think 20, in the Women 20, in the Business 20, the other engagement groups that are supporting the G20. And the action for this implies a national, a regional, and a global action. So you cannot deal with it in a local only thought about inequalities. You have to deal with it in a global thought about inequalities.
I want to touch on that in just a moment, but first, Adriana, Claudia just mentioned at the introduction that we hear so much about social inequality, but sometimes she suggested maybe we don't offer a definition of it sometimes. And we know that there are plenty of inequality measures that are sort of outside climate change, obviously, and then there's the interactions that happen. It makes some of this worse. Define social inequality for us, and then that kind of interface with climate change and what we're seeing in terms of where it's going to get worse, how one is going to amplify the other.
So just to start...
Big question again, sorry.
Yeah. Just to start, I think it's music to my ears to see a global forum like this one really having social and environment at the same time, because 10 years ago, that was not the case. Unfortunately, people that were in the climate change arena, biodiversity was not included the S, the social. So that is the half glass full. But of course, there is the half glass empty. And going to your question, I think you have women in the center, so women is half of the population. In some countries, it's slightly higher than half the population, and they are the one most affected. But what women? Not all women. So when you think Brazil, like climate change effects, and we just saw last week a big flow in Porto Alegre and Rio Grande do Sul arena. So it's the poor communities in the urban areas that are the most affected. if you looked at population, for example, around 40% of the families have female households, because normally those women are left alone with the children, the parents, the illness people, so they really are the ones taking care of that. When you think about the rural places or communities in Amazonas, because those communities don't offer opportunities of economic development, normally men and the youth leave the community, and it remains women there with children and elderly people. So inequality is really how you are not having access and all your human rights fulfilled. So you have lots of people that don't have access to health, don't have access to education, don't have access to house, and more access. So you need to look all those populations, and I have been talking about that yesterday, this morning, and I will reinforce here. Intersectionality is everything. When you think about those inequalities, you cannot have just one look. For example, if you just look at rural population, you will not see the differences of women and men. You will not see the differences of indigenous and other communities. So you need to have some lens to make sure your policy is really addressing what is really affecting the ones that are most left behind. So for me, it's quite surprising that despite all the good figures, for example, McKinsey told if we end the gender inequalities, 28 trillion GDP. We heard this morning like rural women would be 1 trillion. So you have lots of super numbers that in general business and governments would love that. But why, when we talk that they are related to social inequality, people refuse to see that as an opportunity and just to say, no, that's a problem, that's a cost, that's not an investment. So those are a few initial reflections that I can continue, but this is a conversation. So.
I mentioned the pandemic earlier, and obviously we're seeing a lot of climate effects around the world, disasters in Brazil right now.
Yes.
What did the pandemic, how instructive was it for the role of crises, or what crises do to women in particular? Was it especially instructive for us? And then the disasters we're seeing now, are we sort of understanding how these crises affect women as they, lead the household, as they work in the household, as they work in their jobs? What are we seeing?
I have to be honest that I have a hope when we had the pandemic crisis. Of course, it was too bad for women. Women in general were the ones most affected by labor, because in many societies and in many families, women are the ones responsible for the unpaid care work. And during the pandemic, even if you have conditions to pay, you didn't really have that option because it was closed. So there was a very bad thing, because women were the most affected one. Violence against women increased. Lots of the indicators, for example, women's participation in the labor force in Brazil came back 30 years ago. So it was a big hit. And I'm giving the number of Brazil because I have in my mind, but around the world is the same. But on the other hand, at that time I saw, because everybody is being affected, everybody is feeling the pain, so everybody is understanding the value of unpaid work, because now even the rich families are having to take care of their home, of their children, of their elderly people. So, and I think we never saw a collaboration as we saw in the pandemic. Of course, the countries that got the vaccine later were the ones with worse conditions and not in the center of the fabrication. But nevertheless, in 2 years, we were able to have a huge collaboration. So those things gave me hope at that time. But right now, it seems that we human being forgot what was the pandemic. So we are fighting again, even like when I see those labor work companies telling that flexible work is not an option anymore, that everybody has to go back to the office. When you are treating everybody the same, but when you have the obligation to go to the office every day, if you are living far away from the office, if you have more responsibilities outside your productive work, you are the one most affected. So although it's an equal policy to everyone, people are affected in different ways. So I keep asking myself, what kind of pain do we need to feel to go faster? Because even when we see those crises that we are seeing right now, war in Ukraine, war in Israel, if you are a privileged person, far away with your air condition, with the ability to rebuild your house, you are not feeling the pain as the other ones. And unfortunately, I think when we don't feel the pain, it has been hard to change the way we look ahead.
Deborah, in South Africa, you could say that we see this every single day with load sharing, something that you and I were just talking about, the scheduled blackouts that happen because of the electric grid's incapacity to fully function. That is a daily demonstration of inequality there, not to mention the pandemic. South Africa had a very hard pandemic. Have these encouraged the government there to take this issue of social inequality seriously as we see the effects of climate change growing and growing as well?
So I think we must distinguish between political rhetoric and action on the ground. So you must remember, I mean, the South African democracy is still new, and the core value system informing that democracy is ridding our society of inequality, because we were one of the few countries around the world that actually institutionalized inequality. So it's there, it's the core political rhetoric of the country. It's used in different ways. But even that large agenda has got derailed by elements of poor governance, lack of resources, political infighting. And so this is the problem, is that there's a stated intention, and certainly progress has been made, and I think this is currently characteristic where our society is. If we do some deep introspection, it's not that we haven't been moving. For example, societies in South Africa on improving conditions of the poor and isolated, or on climate change. We have been moving, but the transitions are incremental, they're not transformative. And if you look at the work the IPCC has done and other global assessments, it's about this whole of society approach. Everyone has to be at the table. But there are these confounding processes within society which limit that level of ambition. And the signs are there that we're beginning to backtrack. So, for example, I think it was a couple of weeks back, the World Bank released a report which indicated of the 75 poorest countries in the world, of course, many of which are in Africa, the vast majority of those are now getting poorer. And so we're seeing a reversal in the development trends. Now, in the 21st century, when we've never had as much knowledge as we've currently had, when we've never had as many resources, we should not be in a position where a standard political mantra, of course, is reducing inequality, inequity, and injustice, where poor countries are now literally experiencing a reverse of development trends. So there's a big difference between political rhetoric and the political will to change, because that does fundamentally mean that those who have to give up something for those who don't have. Mm-hmm. And this is a fundamental problem. I suspect we're still a fairly poorly evolved primate, and because of that, greed is an aspect of the way we run the world. And there are vast resources. I mean, despite all of the science, and bear in mind that the IPCC has been telling the world about this for 3.5 decades, we're still putting $7 trillion every year into fossil fuel subsidies. So the science is extremely clear. Whole of society approach, we have to dramatically transform. This is the decade. Bear in mind, the science is telling us that if we had any hope of achieving 1.5, we would have to plateau out our emissions by 2025, which means, as we sit here, emissions should be going down. But what was reported at the end of last year, highest ever emissions, 419 parts per million. So, a lot of rhetoric, but we're not turning that into action, which is the fundamental problem.
We're here to talk about the solutions, despite that kind of outlook, of course. I think it's a really important point, though, about the difference between poverty reduction and inequality reduction. I want to turn back to you, Luciana, because you and I talked about this the other day. inequality is a major theme for Brazil, for the G20. Domestically, what is it doing to address this? It's a very unequal society. It's also a young democracy as well. There's been a change in government, quite a significant change, and in terms of priorities, what are the levers that Brazil, the concrete levers that they're going to pull to address inequality domestically?
We have to think this in different levels. We have inequalities in access to services, for example, inequalities in education services, inequality in health services, and inequalities in housing services, and this should be addressed by the new government in the sense that we are trying to put the housing system to function for the poorest and the most needed one in the population. We also addressing the things and inequalities that we increased during the pandemics for the health system. And you have a huge challenge ahead of us in respect to quality of education and inequality in access to education. And foremost, there's not equally distributed between regions and not between the groups of populations. So when you look at the educational level of women in Brazil, they are higher than men. But when you go to the labor market, women receive less than men. So this is not a problem of qualification, it's a problem of discrimination. So dealing with discrimination for ethnic and racial groups, dealing with discrimination for the women in the labor market is essential also. So there is a law that was approved in Brazil for equal wages between men and women that are doing the same thing. And this is being approved, but now is in debate by part of the ones that says that, oh, this is not something that we should be ruling by law. But all the actions that we have done that made some progress in the fields has been a state's compromise with society about affirmative actions, about law, and about the implementation of these policies. So to equal opportunities and to do this inequalities change, you have to do structural change, you have to change social norms, and it's not something that will go naturally. We are not one of the most unequal countries in the world, so that nobody was getting their 5 houses and give one for the ones that are living in the street. You have to have norms, and you have to have education, you have to have police willingness to do that, political willingness to do that, societal willingness to do that. We have a tax reform now that tackles some of our problems, but it's not enough for inequalities. You have to change our tax system to reduce regressiveness of payment. For example, the payment for income in Brazil of the 1% richest is the same of the 40% poorest, the same percent distribution. So this is something that we have to tackle. We don't have to have in the world in Brazil 50% of the income concentrated in 1% richest one. So we are also debating in the G20 a tax on fortunes to finance climate change, to finance structural reforms. So this global tax has to be done. If you're done in one country and not in the others, what will happen? The capital and the fortunes will evade from that country. It's not something that will solve in a national territory. You have to debate in the G20 and even in bigger forums.
What is the receptiveness amongst the public in Brazil for these issues? Because we're talking about a tightly divided society here. We saw that in the last election. Yeah. These aren't huge margins that elections are being won by. It's very tight. It's very politically, I guess, difficult right now. When you're talking about tax reform, even if you're not talking about something like a wealth tax, which is already divisive enough, if you're talking about changing, capturing more tax revenue from even not the richest, that's already going to be a difficult sell. Is the government willing to actually stake its administration on some of these real levers that are designed to address inequality, or is that something that it's going to not really follow through on?
When we think about the first reform that we have, I've been in the institutions that has been discussing tax reform since the 90s. And when discussing this tax reform that is simplifying the system, I said, no, this is not going through. So they did a political witness and did a coordination for this tax reform. The other one will be more difficult because the other one will use to work with some structural things that are more difficult in Brazil. But there's a willingness to put this through, and there was to do some consultations to see and to show the population that is in the benefit of all. That's what's most important, because what we see is that in the city that was saying the flood now, it is one of the most richest cities in Brazil. It's not a poor city. It's one of the most richest states in Brazil. So it have to have a flood to destroy everything for the richest one so that you have action. No, you have to prevent. And it's the communication about it and the consultation about it and the political effects of not doing something had to be clear for not only the population, but for our parliament and for our governments and for our local governments and for the society. So we have to deal with these difficulties and try to put it on progress, tax reform that is more progressive, but it's not enough. We know that tax reform is part of the process. We have also to deal with the possession of land and the problems of territorial organization in the country. So there's a lot of other reforms to change the structural inequality in Brazil and in the world.
Adriana, how difficult a sell is that for a government like Brazil's to say, see what's happening here in this very wealthy state in Brazil? Now, we want you to know that ultimately it's going to take a shift in resources, a shift in inequality. Something that Deborah had just mentioned was you're taking from one side and giving to the other. This isn't just pushing more money at the problem, but you're saying fundamentally you are going to have to accept less and you're going to have to accept more. Is that not a difficult sell? How do you make that sell in a society as divided as Brazil's?
If you sell like that, your chances will be too low. But I think we can sell in other ways. I think there is really very good economic opportunities if those people that are suffering, they are social entrepreneurs. They are coming up with solutions that could solve lots of our problems. And because people are not paying attention to them, or because it's not of the interest of the power people, those solutions are remaining this island. So gets good for that small community, but are not being scaling up. So I think I was discussing yesterday with a colleague from Brazil here from PwC that you need to show all the opportunities so people can really buy that. But you also need to change norms and cultures, because I go to the tax thing that Luciana brought. Today in Brazil, the maternity leave is quite reasonable. It's 4 months, and you have a law that if companies want to give 2 additional months, they can deduct it from income tax. But guess what? The number of companies that take this incentive it's really, really small. So this legislation has been in place, I think, for more than 10 years, and people don't use that because they think when a woman is in a maternity leave, they are taking vacation, what is completely wrong, and I'm losing money. We're not losing money. In Brazil, the company gets reimbursed for the salary of the women that are in maternity leave till the highest salary in the union. So who have salaries above that are only a few people, so it's not a cost for the companies. But it's still, when you talk to people, lots of people think about as a cost. And if we don't have children, the world, as some of the development countries know, get lots of problems if you have much more elder people than you. So there is this portion that it's solutions, but it's also people understand that those solutions will be good for everyone. So it's hard when you ask it, and I think someone brought that up yesterday. If you never had economic opportunities, and I'll tell you, you cannot do anything in your land in Amazonia because we needed to protect. that's not a way to sell. But if I go there to the indigenous community, and then guess what? Do you understand the carbon credit market? Can I teach you how to play on that so you are not being used and misleading? Can I teach you to use biomass to produce your own energy so you can have schools at night in your community? You can have freezers to your fish be saved and you sell that with more efficiency. That's another story. So it's not easy, but you have to show people not what they are going to lose, but also what they are going to gain in a new perspective. But there is things can be good for everyone.
Deborah, is that where the hope is, really, is on the smallest, most grassroots level, the community level, about being able to talk about solutions, concrete solutions there? You mentioned before that scaling those up is so difficult, especially when you have multiple layers of government that sometimes don't work with each other, where there are obviously party divisions, where there's constant elections. Is it really, does everything have to begin there? Or is that just a Herculean effort to really go through all of these small communities and then try and find some sort of commonality?
I think I'm a huge fan of local level work. I've spent 30 years working at the local government level. So I think it's an absolutely vital section of society that can work, but I don't think we should romanticize the ability for local level action to fundamentally create the transformation that is required. I mean, organizing at community levels can do all sorts of wonderful things, but communities cannot build bulk infrastructure by themselves. They cannot organize the financing that is required. And development is a fundamental element of building resilience, particularly in the parts of the world that we represent. I mean, you've got probably the two most unequal countries in the world at this table. So I think there's a lot that can be done at the local level, but there is a glass ceiling that you can't cross unless you've got national and international support. But my frustration, and I'll keep coming back to this a bit like a broken record, is everything we're talking about is assuming that we are working within the current status quo, the world that we currently know. And we've heard it's beset by challenges and so on. What the science is pointing to, and what Johan indicated, is the world we're looking into. So those missing 3 to 4 decades that Johan spoke about, the 2 generations of humanity who will have to exist in that suboptimal world, is a very different world. So, for example, the Amazon is one of the systems which is at the tipping point once we move into that realm of 1.5 and 2. So we're making an assumption that the Amazon will be there in its current form to provide the resources that create livelihoods across a society. What happens when it isn't there? When we can't use wetlands to reduce flood risk in our urban areas? And then you need to bring in the grey infrastructure because there is no alternative, and that requires the big funding. So that's the problem, is we're staring into this world where all of the bets are off. The rules of the game are fundamentally changed. So yes, local action is important here and now. We can do a lot, but it has to be multi-level governance. The problem is we step into a new world. And we're not talking about what the rules of the game are in that world and what the tools are, because the tools be very different, because we can't make the assumptions that we make in this world about what resources are available. And you will have compacted inequality, because you'll have inequality which is, as in the case of South Africa and Brazil, born out of long years of poverty, inequality, colonialism, slavery in some cases, but compacted by this new level of inequality brought by rapid transitioning to try and bring temperatures down by extreme and intensified impacts. And that's the problem, is we're talking about a very different world where the local will be disempowered simply because you'll be caught up in the cycle of extreme events, destruction, reconstruction, rebuilding, extreme events. We heard it clearly today, the fiscal space begins to decrease. So the opportunities for local decrease as we move into the new world. And that's why I keep coming back to the fact, as part of our discussion, great, we need to do all of these ambitious things we've heard around the table, but someone's got to have an honest discussion about when those things no longer work.
That seems to push the issue at a much higher level then, of course, than the local level, which we've also seen hasn't really gotten us very far to this point. Is the loss and damage fund particularly some sort of, I'm not going to say solution, but is it a lever here that could come in that way? Obviously, there are a lot of questions around its its existence in the first place, how to what extent it's actually going to be donated to. The board had its first meeting, I believe, just a few days ago, and there are questions about the role it's going to play and whether it's really going to make inequality part of its ambitions. I don't know if any one of you, whoever is interested in this, maybe to answer, is that something that can potentially address or begin to address on this much broader level where we channel resources to try and tackle, to some extent, some of these issues?
Well, I was a negotiator for South Africa in the field of loss and damage for a number of years. And we heard from a colleague today around this very table. She referred to the Loss and Damage Fund as a Band-Aid. It's an indication that opportunity to mitigate and adapt our way out of the problem has been lost, that we're now moving into a world of permanent loss and damage. And the problem is we're still talking about the flows of millions versus the needed flows of trillions. But it's not only loss and damage, it's what happens, irreversible loss. What do you do with irreversible loss? So these are things that you can't buy back from. So what are the kind of safety nets that we need to be talking about now when we're talking about this world of loss and damages, where whole countries, we heard this morning, a whole island disappeared. What happens when whole countries, languages, cultures, ecosystems disappear? I mean, think about the impact on a person's psyche of living in that kind of world, the geopolitical instability. I mean, look at Africa, probably the most vulnerable continent in the world. 3 billion people by the end of the century. If you've got 3 billion people with nothing left to lose, do you think you'll have a stable world?
No.
And these are the kinds of questions we shouldn't be shying away from. This should be the challenge to the next Global Solutions Summit, is to peer into that world, to think about it, to think about the options, the safety nets, the winners, the losers. Who's going to lose? What ecosystems? What people? What can we do to come in and support those? Because those actions we need to be talking about now. You can't wake up on an unnamed Monday morning and, oh my dear, we're in this new world, what do we do now? We've got to have that plan B, and no one's talking about plan B.
Stephen, can I jump in?
Of course.
I think when Deborah brings up the fact that we need to change the logical, one very important logical is the capital logical, the money, the macroeconomic. If we don't change that logical, we will not be able. And yesterday in the task force of combating hunger, poverty, and inequalities, and I think that's in the article of social inequality, like last year you have 236 new billionaires, and you have more than 600 million and 700 million of people in poverty and hungry. And then we started, was a small debate that most of those billionaires, they love to spend lots of money in space trips because they want to find Mars. But can we have all the people from Earth to Mars? No. Is it, are you sure that even if you are get to Mars, you are going to live there? I recommended strongly the Look At Up movie, so you may have a journey and up dying when you achieve there. So we need to change that logical, because if even like a 10% of the super rich money goes to funds that can solve those kind of things, it's a much better world. Yesterday I heard here, if you cannot save all, nobody will be saved. So what the hell, those people don't understand that. And so it's complicated. So the macroeconomic logical and the capital logical needs to be reshaped. If we don't reshape, you don't award people that are trying to do the social investments, because you are a company, for example, and I look lots of companies that are doing things in ESG. Sometimes they get punished by the market. Sometimes you see big venture capital saying, I don't care about ESG anymore. Yesterday we heard here, so I don't call ESG, so I don't get punished, but I continue to do. So what a world is that, with so many important things that we know we have a very limited time to change.
Then maybe we bring it down to what's worth saving the most, or maybe a focal point. And the Amazon basin really has been a focal point of inequalities and an extremely important ecosystem that has to be saved. If that can't be saved, then I think there's a general belief, then what does that even point to? This is an administration now that professes to taking that more seriously. Luciana, maybe you can talk about the steps that it's taking to sort of wrap up our panel when we talk about the concrete steps. Maybe some of that's land rights, maybe some of that is intergovernmental work, where it works, where it doesn't work.
Well, first of all, you have to have the ability to respect dialogue and define policies for local communities. And when saying about the indigenous population in that area and also other populations living in that area, they have to be part of the policy discussion and also part of the process of building these policies. So what the government did is creating a lot of, reestablishing, in fact, a lot of councils that has been not working or even not part of the government before in the previous years, to bring them to the debate, to bring them to the construction of these policies. This is quite important. We have to have local with national to build these policies. But the fact that there is a dispute of territory there, and that dispute is not something that will solve only with the definition from federal government. You have to do this in lots of dialogue. So the demarcations of the territories for the indigenous people and bringing this to a policy of new industrialization, for example, that considers bioeconomy, that considers the green economy and things like that, is a debate that we have to do to show the population at the whole country that there is an important process that is going in the Amazon region, that is going in the other biomes in Brazil, that will benefit the population, the national population, but not only the national population, because we have also the regional population in Latin America that has to be considered. What is being done is first is thinking and coordinating policies is central. So if I have like all the ministries, each one working in one direction, this is not work. And besides that, not coordination only locally, but we have industrial policies in the US, incentives, huge incentives there in the US, industrial policies here and in Europe, a lot of incentives here. So you have to think about these policies in a more integrated way, because if you don't, we are going to continue to offer not decent work, not inclusion, not the process there for bringing populations that are going to be here to look for better jobs. And this is what we cause problems of social cohesion inside the country and between countries. So we have to think more globally and also locally. And coming from national populations, local populations, to regional populations, to global population, thinking that the debate about trust and the debate about social cohesion is as central as the policy in itself. Because if you don't, you'll see the effects of these problems and the distrust in all policies.
All right, and with that, we'll have to leave it there for this panel. I feel like there's a lot more we could discuss, but that's our time. I want to thank all of our panelists, and I want to thank everyone for your attention. Thank you. Thank you.
I can hear the sadness in your voice, Stephen. I'm sorry we have to cut you short all of the time, but that's what happens when you tackle a really important topic. Thanks for sketching the paths out. After a short break in this room, we will stay close to the topics, but we will go one focus level up and look at paths to collective action in the BRICS and G20 forums, so which are the right fora to really address and attack the problems we have. And for that, we will use a format that is quite engaging. So if you're tired now, get a coffee and then come back in here, it works. We'll work with these, we'll pass these out, and see you again if you want to at